Hello, my name is Quiva. I'm the Events Manager with Limerick Chamber, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar, Managing and Engaging Your Workforce Remotely. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Today's topic is a pertinent issue many managers and owners are facing, so we hope this webinar will provide you with practical supports to assist you in these challenging times. We would like to extend our gratitude to today's sponsors, Careerwise Recruitment, who are making it possible to deliver this webinar. Careerwise Recruitment have recently celebrated 21 years in business. They operate nationally and provide fantastic supports in the region that assist and guide the recruitment process. All details about today's sponsors, Careerwise Recruitment, can be found on our website, and more information will be issued in our post-event comms. We are thrilled to work with the fantastic and insightful Jane Mitchell of Integrum for today's session. Jane has over 15 years experience and will no doubt provide us with new tidbits during this webinar. Limerick Chamber Skillnets will be hosting a number of workshops with Jane over the coming weeks. These workshops will be looking at leadership in a disruptive world, re-engaging and developing teams, as well as performance management. More information about these sessions will be issued to all those registered, so please feel free to share with your networks. Lastly, please feel free to get interactive with today's session by availing of the chat and Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screens. You can network by introducing yourself or your company in the chat feature, or asking any questions you wish via the Q&A feature located at the bottom. We will address all questions at the end of today's session. We will also be sharing a recording of today's session with all those registered and all those on the waiting list, so please feel free to share amongst your teams. We have a number of supportive webinars via our website and the Limerick Chamber YouTube page, so also be sure to check those out. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and I would now like to welcome Joe Robbins, Director of Careerwise Recruitment, to make a sponsor's address.
Thanks, Quiva. Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to thank Quiva and the Limerick Chamber team for hosting this event, and I'm delighted that we at Careerwise Recruitment can sponsor it. This is a hugely interesting subject, and I have to say, since this all started, a lot of us, including myself, are struggling with the whole thing around management of our people, our own family situation, and our own sort of self-motivation, and so it's hugely difficult. And what I'd say is that in my experience, one size does not fit all. And I think what we all need in this is an understanding, flexibility, being nimble and compassionate towards our colleagues and ourselves. And there's people really struggling. So, you know, on that basis, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Jane's got to say, and also in terms of picking up some tips that Jane's going to get across. So thanks very much, and over to you now, Jane.
Great, thanks, Joe. So you're all very welcome. Very excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today. Very passionate about the topic of managing and engaging your teams. And the reason for that is, in my career over the last 15 years, I've seen how this can really have a significant impact in organizations. Certainly not in the times that we're operating in now, but we'll talk about that context in just a bit. A little bit about my own background. As Quiva said, I run an organization called Integrum, but my background has been in the multinational sector for the last 15, 18 years. And so I've worked in various HR roles, but primarily in learning and development and talent development functions. And so I've spent quite a bit of time both teaching the topic of performance and leading and managing engagement, but also as a leader myself. And so I have a very clear understanding of how difficult it can be to manage a team and to get the optimum performance from them. But doing it in a virtual and remote environment is even more challenging. So today I'm going to share with you some of my experiences, and I hope that you will take away one or two things today that you will find useful. They're going to have an impact on your organization. So I'm going to start now by sharing my slide deck. Great, so hopefully everybody can see that. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about the environmental context And Joe has referred to that already, so it's hugely important to our discussion today. We're going to talk about what engagement looks like at work. I'm going to share with you just 3 tools today that you can take away with you in the short time we're together. They're not complex tools, they're simple tools, but they're not easy. So there is a bit of work in implementing those. And we'll talk about some practical strategies around the remote working environment at the end. And we'd love to hear your questions in the chat. We'd be delighted to answer any specifics that you would be interested in getting the answers to. So we're going to start with the environment, and we've been talking about the VUCA environment for about 10 years now, and it's very topical, this volatile, uncertain environment that we have been working in. And as leaders, our charge has been to actively engage with uncertainty and provide that stability to our teams and building trust in our organizations. And that hasn't changed. It has intensified somewhat, well, significantly, shall we say, in the environments that we're operating in now. So the context within which we've been leading and managing for up until now in our careers has changed significantly, and that has an impact really on how we lead and the style that we use. So we're going to talk just for a minute around those challenges. So those challenges are significant. We'd love to hear from you in our poll around what those challenges look like. So Caoimhe, if you're able to share the poll for me. Great. So if you could take a couple of minutes and maybe select one of the choices we've given you. Hopefully we've given you a choice that is palatable for you. We really want to hear about what those greatest challenges are that you're facing when managing and engaging your teams. So we're hearing a lot about the constantly changing business priorities because businesses are being significantly impacted and the market is changing constantly. Also, the lack of connection to people due to the remote nature of work. So that has been really challenging for folks to manage and feeling that they're losing that connection. Hearing a lot about a loss of team spirit. So for those of you that are managing teams, do you feel that team spirit that you would have had when you were all in the same location has now kind of died away somewhat? Managing your own workload. So we're hearing about everything takes longer remotely, and so communication can be really significantly time consuming, and you as a leader, your own workload outside of your people management responsibilities can be very challenging. And then also keeping yourself motivated, and Joe alluded to that in the introduction as well, so that can be very tough too. So Caoimhe, I don't know if we've had many folks respond to the poll. Great. 33% of you are challenged with the changing business priorities, and for sure that is significant. A lack of connection to people due to the remote nature of work, and then a loss of team spirit and managing your own workload too. So that's great. Thanks for your responses. We're going to cover all those topics in the content that's coming up. So hopefully, as I said, you'll be able to take a couple of nuggets away with you today that you're going to be able to use from a practical standpoint. So let's level set for a few minutes on what we mean by engagement at work. So some of you will be very familiar with this term and will work for organizations that have a very strong focus on employee engagement. And for others, it's not a concept that maybe you've given a huge amount of thought to previously. So when we're talking about what engagement looks like from an employee standpoint, we're talking about employees who go that extra mile. So people who give that discretionary effort. People who come into work and are very enthusiastic, and their enthusiasm rubs off on other people in the organization. So a bit of a force of nature, very positive attitudes at work. We certainly see a lot of research around people who are engaged at work give our customers a much better experience. Folks who have a lot of energy for their work, and you'll see that in how they operate. And there's a lot of research around engaged employees being much more creative and innovative. So I'd love you to stop and think for a minute about perhaps somebody who works for you, or maybe you yourself, and the types of behaviors that those folks display when they're really engaged. And those 3 strategies that we're going to look at today, the purpose of those is to help people to reach this state of engagement at work. So I'm going to play a short video for you now on what engagement looks like in organizations, and what disengagement looks like too. But just going to share, it's a 5-minute video, so it's a shortened version. It's quite short, but really just want to get a sense of what that looks like from an organizational standpoint.
So what exactly is employee engagement? Why should you as a business leader or a manager care about it? Well, over the next few minutes, I'm going to define it using what we call the X model of engagement and talk about how you can build a more engaged workforce in your organization to help drive performance. Let's start by looking at what your organization is trying to achieve, your success. Success is defined by your business goals and most likely your financial targets, and how well you achieve those goals, your performance. Core values are also an important part of your strategy since they help guide the daily actions of your organization. To stay competitive, your organization needs individuals who are willing and able to perform at higher levels, to give more at work, to give maximum contribution to the organization. But it's not something that you can mandate or delegate to your managers, and it's not easy. Increased contribution is the prize of a more engaged workforce, but it's only one half of the story. It's just one half of what we call the engagement equation. Individual employees are on a separate path toward their own and unique definition of success at work. It's based on personal values, goals, career aspirations, and work-life needs. And it could be defined as greater compensation, professional growth, greater work-life balance. But unlike the organization, there's no one answer. There's no right answer. Individuals are all looking for work that works for them personally, and they're looking for maximum satisfaction. And when I say individuals, I mean everyone, executives, managers, and individual contributors. They're all pursuing their own individual definitions of success, and ultimately, they need to take control of their own engagement. So, the organization is pursuing its definition of success, and individuals are pursuing theirs. These 2 strategies intersect daily at a place we call the job. This is the point where what the organization needs employees to give and what employees want to get from the job come together. We define full engagement as the intersection of maximum contribution for the organization and maximum satisfaction for the individual. This is the apex in our model, a sustainable level of high performance that mutually benefits both parties. Of course, as we look across any organization, not everyone's at the apex, certainly not all the time. There's a wide distribution in terms of contribution, with high performers on one end and people who aren't contributing much on the other. Individuals, too, don't always get what they're looking for. There are different levels of satisfaction. Some people are fortunate enough to be at the apex, high on both contribution and satisfaction. We call this group the engaged. Now let's look at some other scenarios. Some people are high on satisfaction, but they aren't contributing fully. There are a few things that might be going on here. The person might be new to the organization or new to the role. Although satisfaction's high, they're not yet fully up to speed. We call this group the honeymooners. We also find people that are incredibly busy here. They're working hard, but on the wrong things. Or people who have found a nice cozy spot in the organization and are content with minimum contribution. So whether they're running hard on an exercise wheel or tucked away somewhere cozy, we call this group the hamsters. On the opposite side of the model, we have individuals who are delivering great results, but for one reason or another, not getting what they want from the work. We call this group the crash and burners. And you need to pay close attention to this group. Clearly, their level of contribution needs to be sustained for the organization to succeed. But left unmanaged, these individuals will eventually find one of 2 exit routes from this unsatisfying situation. They might quit at a great known cost to the organization, or more likely, they'll simply pull back on their contribution and drift into the lower part of the model. In effect, they quit and stay. The impact of drifting isn't as obvious as when they leave outright, but the impact on performance can be substantial. Here they join the disengaged, low on satisfaction and contribution, where no one is getting what they need from the relationship. Disengaged employees often have turned an emotional corner, and their attitudes and behaviors can be contagious to the other groups. Here, the partnership between the company and the individual is clearly in need of a fix, but your existing performance management processes have failed to address the situation. So what about the people in the center? This is an important group we refer to as the almost engaged. Important because they tend to be a large part of the employee population doing a decent job and reasonably satisfied. They're more employable than the disengaged and more likely to consider a new employer than the fully engaged. And because they're decent performers, it's tempting to focus your coaching efforts elsewhere. So the challenge for your organization is managing this dynamic, aligning individuals to your goals to achieve maximum contribution, while at the same time supporting individual employees' path to personal success at work. It's a challenge you can't solve with a survey and a few organization-wide initiatives. And it's not solely the job of the executives or the managers. To drive employee engagement, you must make it a daily priority.
So hopefully that short clip gave you a sense of what engagement looks like in organizations. And if you have a knowledge of engagement already, maybe it gave you a deeper insight, and hopefully you can see maybe some of your organization in the categories that he described. Obviously, our goal today is to try and convert as many folks in the organization into that actively engaged category. And the reason for that is we want to see the impact on productivity and performance, which is more important now than it has ever been in the environment that we're in. There is a lot of research out there around the link between engagement and performance. This is just one statistics that I've taken to show you today. It's from 2015, but you can see the direct correlation between those who are engaged and their productivity is significantly higher than those even in a satisfied category. But those who are dissatisfied or disengaged are significantly lower performers and have a real impact on our organization. And therefore, we're going to look at our 3 strategies now on how to address that. So the tools, and they are practical tools that you can use post this training today. The first one is around creating individual meaning and purpose with your employees. The second one is about an open dialogue that you can create. And the third one is focused around the team. So the first one, as I mentioned, was around individual meaning and purpose. And we know that people are more engaged at work when they have a sense of purpose in the work that they're doing. When the work matters to them, they have more positive energy, they focus better, they have greater perseverance and resilience, which is hugely important, obviously, in the environment that we're dealing with at the moment. And so I have a tool here, which I'm going to share with you. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking through how to use this tool. And so what I've crafted out here is a Venn diagram with talents in the blue circle, passions in the red circle, and the organization priorities in the yellow circle. So we're going to start with talents. And so if you were having a conversation with an employee around their goals that they're working on at the moment, and 33% of you have talked about business priorities constantly changing. A tool like this, which you can pull out on a regular basis in your one-on-ones with employees, can really help you on managing those priorities that are constantly changing. So the first one is the blue circle, the talents. So here is where we ask employees to input into sharing the areas they feel that they're talented in or they have strength in, and asking them questions around perhaps where they have gotten feedback in the past from either yourself as their manager or from previous managers or from peers or customers around areas that they feel that they have strength. The second circle is around passions. So here's where we ask employees around things that they like to do at work. So what are the tasks that they currently are working on or would like to work on that they like doing? So here we're asking them, when you're thinking about coming to work on a particular day, and you think about the type of work that you're doing, which days are you more excited about coming to work? What things are you doing on those days? And then lastly, we've got the organization. And this is where you have got a list of tasks and goals and projects, etc. And that you need to allocate out to your team that need to be worked on. And so what we're really trying to do here is we're looking at the black section in the center here, and what we're trying to do is get as much congruence between the three circles as we possibly can. So have somebody working on as much of their talents as they can, as much of their passions as they can, and as much as of the organization goals as they can. And that gives us a real bang for our buck from an engagement perspective. You'll see down here, talks about, on average, about half of workers are not completely clear about what they're supposed to be doing at work. And you may find that quite shocking. But that is what the research tells us. And from my experience in the market, we do hear that quite a bit, especially at the moment. So because priorities are constantly changing and leaders and managers aren't always perhaps engaging in conversations with individuals around why that is happening, they feel a little bit lost. So in order to bring this model to life a little bit, I'm going to give you a personal example of the talents, passions, and organization, and how, you know, merging those together can really cause that engagement to come to life. So I use a personal example. In a previous life, I worked in an organization where I led a talent development group, and I used to spend quite a bit of time leading and managing people, but also leading out training sessions. And one of the sessions that I used to do a couple of times a year was a session where we would bring all new leaders together, people who had potential and were moving into leadership positions, but also folks who had been, you know, leaders for a short period of time, and really teaching them some of the core elements of leading and managing people. And so it was an area that I felt really passionate about. So big tick there in the red box around passions. I really liked bringing those folks together and running those sessions over 2 or 3 days. And the reason I really liked that was I found that I was really giving something back to those folks, and you could really see the learning in the room, and you could see how they were going to be able to use that learning. I found that very motivating. But also it was an area that I had been told that I was talented at, so I had strength in it. And so it made me feel good to use those skills. And then lastly, in relation to the organization, we were an organization that had had a very heavy focus on developing talent within the organization. Was really important to us, and it was one of our key leadership competencies. So I knew I was contributing to that broader purpose of the organization. As I mentioned already, we know that that's really engaging for employees. So when sharing the tasks that need to be completed with employees in the organization section, helping them see how they relate to the bigger picture, the strategy of the organization, impacting on customers, for example, is very motivating for folks. So this is a conversation that you can be having with people on a regular basis. If you think it's a conversation that you might find difficult to start and you weren't really sure where you would start, one of the things that you can do is you can show them the diagram and ask them to recall a couple of experiences they've had over the last 12 months where they have felt really engaged and energized at work. And then ask them, you know, specifically what were they doing? What strengths or talents do they think they were using? And why do they really like that particular piece of work? So it's a really simple tool that you can use. And as I said, you can use it on a regular basis with folks with those changing priorities. The second piece then is around creating an open dialogue. So hearing a lot in organizations that I'm working in, and also material that I'm reading, you know, when researching for programs, that a lot of folks are feeling that they're not having those dialogues with their leaders and managers. So conversations have become less frequent because they have to be organized now, maybe through a Zoom call or a Teams call, whereas previously you were having those ad hoc organic conversations in the office. So here's a real challenge, and we'll talk about it towards the end of the webinar today, but really setting up those more focused sessions is really important in order to create those conversations. Those organic conversations have gone away, and therefore those need to be recreated in a more mindful way. And so I have some research here that I'd like to share with you from the Gallup organization. And this is around remote working specifically, because that's really what the context is for our conversation today. So you can see from the data that I'm displaying on the screen, and this is specifically in relation to feedback, but we can see the engagement levels rising for those folks who work from home 80 to 100% of the time. So remote workers essentially. Their engagement levels raise at least 10 percentage points when they're having those feedback interactions with their manager more than once a week. And so if we were in a session where we were actively engaging and you weren't muted, you might say to me, well, gosh, you know, my workload is so heavy, I can't be engaging with every single person several times a week. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute and how that might work for you. But certainly more than one engagement on an individual level is recommended when folks are working in a virtual environment. And how are you going to engage with folks in that environment? And so trust is hugely important to focus on, especially in times like we're in now, where people feel very uncertain. So traditional leadership very much focuses on the leader themselves and, you know, their talents and their charisma. The shift over the last 15 years has been that it is really more about leading your people in a trusting way and helping people feel that stability. As you can see here, employees can quickly become mentally paralyzed by the uncertainty and ambiguity in their working lives. And they certainly have uncertainty and ambiguity in their working lives on a daily basis at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time. In fact, we don't know what the announcement is going to be this afternoon that's going to have an impact on our working lives. And therefore, as leaders, opening up that dialogue with trust has never been more important. So what does that really mean? And how do we create trust and build trust with our teams? And so there's 3 core elements for doing that. And I'm starting down in the bottom left-hand corner. This is around the logic piece. Employees have to feel that you know what you're doing as a leader. They need to understand your reasoning and your judgment. And how are they going to know that? Well, you're going to tell them. And I suppose that's one of the ways of opening up that dialogue. You may be making decisions very quickly at the moment because of those changing business priorities and because of your workload. In those interactions, either individually or from a team perspective, it is important to share with employees your reasoning behind why you're making some of the judgments that you're making, as that does have an impact on the trust between you and your team. You might think that it's really, really obvious, but perhaps that's not always the case. So in order to be sure, why not include that in the conversations that you're having with folks? And then secondly, down on the bottom right, we know that leading with empathy creates trust. So helping people feel like you care about them and their success. And how would you do that? Well, I suppose by asking them how they're getting on, how their family is, how are things today, how are things this week, did you have a good weekend, you know, what's stressful for you, etc. So opening up and asking those questions, if you haven't been doing that, is really, really important. And then lastly, that authenticity piece, hugely important when building trust. So I experience the real you. And in order to have a trusting relationship with your employees and to build that engagement, they have to feel like they're seeing the real you. And what does that involve? Well, that involves you sharing some of yourself with them. And nobody is suggesting that you share feelings that you're uncomfortable with, but where you're comfortable sharing feelings around or your thoughts around, you know, how things have been going for you and perhaps your family, if you feel that that's appropriate. And that really does feel, you know, does build that bridge and that trust between you and your team. Perhaps sharing how your, you know, workload is stressful, or, you know, what's going on from a work perspective also. And where can you start with those authentic conversations? So I've included a change curve here just to focus on for a minute or two. And Caoimhe referred to our masterclass, which we're going to be running in the coming weeks, and we will go into this in much more detail, but just a nod to it in the short time that we have today. and maybe sharing with folks how you've been feeling during the journey that you've gone through in the last number of months, the ups and downs of that journey, and maybe where you are today, if you feel comfortable doing that. But also perhaps asking them about their journey. And often on the programs that I deliver, we use this as part of some of the workshops that we do. And I was leading a workshop recently with a team around a team engagement session, and we were using the change curve to talk about how challenging the last number of months have been, and to get the team to open up to each other around those challenges to bring the team closer together. And at the beginning of the exercise, the manager volunteered in this team to share, how they had been getting on over the last number of months, and shared some information around their own struggles and how that had gone for them. And you could physically see the rest of the team open up in relation to their feelings and their struggles, and the supports that they required once the manager had shared how they had gotten on. Again, it's not about sharing feelings or thoughts that you're uncomfortable with, but just sharing, in your comfort zone, I suppose, from that perspective. It does have a real impact on how others are willing to open up and on their engagement at work when you build that trust with them. The trouble we have here with the change curve is up here, as you well know, because I'm sure you've seen this before, on the top of the change curve, we see acceptance. And that's normally where we see this new beginning with whatever change we're talking about. Unfortunately, we don't have a new beginning yet, and we don't know what that new beginning is going to look like. So it's very difficult for folks to come out of the troughs on that change curve and make their way up to acceptance, because as soon as they do, something else shifts in the environment. So at the moment, and over the last number of weeks, with the numbers of cases rising, that has brought folks into a position where they're, kind of sliding back down that curve again and feeling uncertain again about where they are. As a leader and a manager, your charge is to really open up and have those conversations with individuals around how they're feeling. But the first step, perhaps, is for you to, to share that yourself. And so the results are pretty compelling from building those trusting relationships. So we do know that in organizations where there is high trust in the organization, we see, and I've just included some of the statistics here, I haven't included all of them, we see 50% higher productivity, 74% less stress, because I can share how I feel and I have a trusting relationship. I have more energy at work and I'm more engaged at work, and certainly less sick days as a result. So the case is definitely compelling. And so the third area and the third tool from a practical standpoint we're going to move on to is the power of teams. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. The power of teams. So we're going to talk about how you can leverage your team in order to manage and engage your workforce for higher levels of performance. And so we do know this research is from the ADP Institute, and it's very new. It's from 2019, so it is pre-COVID, but it is very relevant. And so they released research where they surveyed 19,000 people, so 1,000 people in 19 countries across the globe. And I have access to that research report. If anybody's interested in it, you can let Caoimhe know and I can send that on. But the material and the research is quite compelling. Those on a team feel twice as much engaged as those who work alone, and those who trust in their organizations double that again. So the bang for your buck is really quite significant when building trust and building teams in the organization. I'm going to show you a short video now around the ideal team member. And so this is research from the ADP Institute, and I think it's about 7 minutes long, but it really talks about the core elements of what make up an ideal team member. And so really, I'd like you to start thinking about what are the elements that you hear in the video that you could recreate in your organization for greater engagement.
Take two.
So let me tell you about Barbara. Barbara, it turns out, is somebody that you're really going to want to know because she is, in fact, the most engaged employee in the world. I know this because as head of the ADP Research Institute, we've just finished this 19-country study. We really wanted to know how high is engagement in different countries and what drives it. But as part of the research, we sliced the data. And we found there's one worker in the world who's more engaged than anyone else. Her name, Barbara, that's a joke. It's not really her name. She's a composite. But when you slice the data, she's a manager or team leader in professional services. She's been with her company 5 years or more. She works on a team. She has a main job, and she's also got kind of a side gig that she does. She's a blogger. Oh, she works at home 80% of the time. When she goes into an office, it happens to be the headquarters of her firm. Her commute, in case you're interested, 31 minutes to 60 minutes. She's been with the company, but have I said that already? She's married, but she doesn't have any kids. She does have a pet, though. A python by the name of, apparently, Gregory. So that's Barbara. Listen, we don't really know that she's got a pet. Well, we know she's got a pet. We don't know that the pet is a python. And we can't be sure that the python's name is Gregory. But everything else prior to that is true. As it happens, women are slightly more engaged than men. As it happens, professional service is slightly more engaging than it is to work in construction, let's say. But of all the things that we know about Barbara, by far the single most powerful one is that she is a member of a team.
A team, of course, is a group of people who've agreed to work together. We like to walk through the world as though people are the same as one another. But you look around you and you see the first thing that strikes you about humanity is we're all different from one another. The best leaders know that the idiosyncrasy of every person is a wonderful thing to be drawn out, that the weirdness of a human being is the best bit. How do you knit weirdness together in the service of something useful? The answer is this splendid piece of technology, thousands of years old, called the team.
If you say you're part of a team, if you feel part of a team, you are twice as likely to be fully engaged at work.
Barbara's part of the gig economy as well, with one full-time job and one side hustle. Are there any lessons there for the world of work?
The two most compelling reasons for people to be gig workers are, number one, that it gives them a greater opportunity to be in control of their lives. 25% of all gig workers around the world give themselves the same title, president. And the second most powerful reason,
the full-time job gives us predictability and stability. The gig job gives us a chance to do something that matters to us.
To do what you love. Some stability here and then some flexibility, creativity there is something that we could all learn from.
We learned Barbara as a remote worker, but that might be a little bit surprising because we think of remote workers being somehow separate. The data says that remote workers who feel like they are part of a team are actually more engaged than co-located workers who come to the office today who feel that they are part of a team.
Clearly, there's some value to working at home and having the creativity and the flexibility that comes with that, the control of your own schedule.
Remote and feeling part of a team trumps co-located and feeling like part of a team. The question is, how can I get more Barbaras?
At the moment, the levels of engagement are not high at all. 15.8% of people are fully engaged at work. That means 85% of us around the world are just coming to work. So our challenge really is, once we get people to come in and join our companies, how do we get them engaged? How do we get them productive?
We would all like to have the world's most engaged person working on our team, to which the answer is you do already. You just have to help them express that and step into that. It's not a question of choosing the right person. There's nothing about Barbara that's inherently engaged. There is a set of things in her environment that each of us could help create at work that brings out the best in Barbara. Do you feel part of a team? Does the team bring out the best in you? That's how you get more Barbaras.
So I don't know about you, but I was quite surprised to hear that remote workers were more engaged than co-located workers, as they refer to them, although we have to remember this wasn't in the COVID-19 environment. But I think it is really interesting research, and there's certainly some takeaways there. Leveraging your team is hugely important, and using your team as an engagement tool, which you may not have done previously. I do want to address the reference to the gig economy, though, in my summary actions, because that's not always possible. So let's go back and just have a quick summary around the first engagement tool, which was around that one-to-one with the employee and figuring out where their strengths and talents are, what they like doing, maybe what they dislike doing, and then what the organization wants them to do. There is an opportunity here to address that gig work. So you may have employees who work full time for you, and so they're not going to be gig workers on the side. Maybe some of them are, but offering folks some level of involvement in the type of work that they're doing, and some choice, if whatever possible, where they get to work on areas that, you know, really fulfill that purpose piece, certainly gives you a real tick on the engagement element for sure. Secondly, opening up that dialogue on a regular basis, dipping your toe in the water there in relation to perhaps sharing your more authentic self with the folks who work for you, sharing your logic around some of your decisions, and, you know, displaying some of that empathy around how they might be feeling in the current environment. And then lastly, utilizing and engaging your team. So setting people up to work with each other remotely and having those sidebar discussions and project teams certainly will help people to feel more engaged and less isolated in this virtual environment. And finally, just some next steps that may be helpful. An individual check-in with each member of your team once a week at least. So if you have 25 people working for you, that's going to be very difficult, but hopefully you don't. So whatever works for you, but at least one check-in towards the beginning of the week, and at least one check-in towards the end of the week. It doesn't have to be formal, and certainly should focus on items outside of the task list, and having those conversations around how things are going from a personal standpoint. Secondly, absolutely a weekly team meeting. And I am hearing in organizations that, you know, those team meetings have fallen off the calendar as workloads have gotten heavier, and folks not coming together as a team or certainly is not helping the engagement and performance conversations. So having that weekly team meeting doesn't have to be very long, 2 if you could, even shorter in time frame, but assigning those work groups, getting people to work together, and you not having as the leader to be involved in all of those. A monthly social event, so we've seen this work, you know, quite well. Those virtual coffees, maybe you know, people sharing their baking, having a quiz night. So the opportunities are endless from that regard, but maybe getting some folks on your team to look at creating those social events virtually, because it doesn't look like we're coming out of this virtual world anytime soon. And so we need to dig into more of those types of events to keep people engaged. And then lastly, encouraging those organic peer-to-peer conversations. So we do hear about Zoom fatigue. And so having people perhaps call each other on the telephone, which nobody seems to be using anymore, but really kind of encouraging those more organic conversations, which would have happened if in the office or if in the facility where you worked. So I hope that you found some practical tools from our session today, and that you'll be able to use those in order to build stronger engagement in your organization and also resulting performance and productivity. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Jane. We have a few questions coming in there on our chat, so I might just present them to you. One of the main questions is just to let everyone know a recording of today's webinar will be issued to everyone who is registered for today's webinar. So the first question is from Margaret there. She said some jobs are very structured and or repetitive without much scope for development. What is the best way to engage with such staff or such roles?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think that, you know, you don't always have the scope in order to completely change the job. And the reason sometimes leaders shy away from conversations like I was talking about is because they're afraid, that people are going to start requesting the type of work that they're not able to provide. But there is always some element of being able to, job craft, as it's now called. So really, I suppose, opening up with that conversation first and getting a sense of where, people might like to expand their responsibilities. And then number two, perhaps seeing if there's any scope within the job to work maybe outside of their existing remit and maybe expand into another function, or assist somebody in another role, or maybe even expand into additional responsibilities in the manager's role. But the first step, I suppose, is kind of getting inside somebody's head and really figuring out, are there areas they'd like to get involved in, and maybe asking for their suggestions around areas that they think they'd like to work in. Hopefully that answers your question.
That's perfect, Jane. Thank you. So we have another question there from Annette. She's asking, do working from home policies help to engage remote workers?
Good question. Thanks, Annette. So I think the working from home policy helps people to understand what's okay and what's not okay from a working from home perspective. And so, yeah, I think, outright, it's not very engaging, but I do think it helps to give guidelines, and so people feel more comfortable with what's allowed and not allowed from a remote working perspective, for sure.
That's really helpful, Jane. Thanks so much. We have another question in there from David. He said, could you share your thoughts on the additional challenges of onboarding new hires into the company? Obviously, that's very difficult at the moment.
Yeah, a very difficult question. So thanks, David. So I've worked with David previously. So yeah, no, it is really challenging, for sure. There's no doubt about that. And I have heard that from organizations. I think more than ever, it's really important to have a very clear schedule of what's going to be covered in the onboarding process. So the tools that you can use are really limited. So, I mean, if you're not bringing somebody on site, then you really are limited, I suppose, to using, Zoom or Teams. But I think introducing those individuals to each other and having interactive exercises on those sessions will really help. I think having, the more folks that you can get involved in the onboarding session around the organization to come in and introduce themselves for a few minutes, is really helpful. And I know in onboarding sessions that I've done previously, we weren't doing as much of that because it's very heavy on resources. I think it might need to go back to a bit of that, because you want to make people feel like they're part of something. I mean, that's really what onboarding is about, is really giving people that sense of, I'm now part of this new organization. I understand what their values are. I understand how people do things around here. So setting up scenarios virtually where they will see people demonstrate that, I think, is a key way of getting folks on board in a more effective way, and keeping those sessions, shorter perhaps, but having a number of them when people are in their first month, as an example. So traditionally you might do 1 or 2 days. Not sure that's going to be as effective in the virtual world, but certainly those key points of connection, maybe in a longer time frame, will really help people to feel more connected.
It does create that culture. You are kind of creating it virtually and you're giving them a taste of the company. So definitely leads into our next question from Dermot. So he's just wondering if some of the benefits of teamwork and engagement comes from the personal bonds that are created in work. Is it from just working beside people all day and not every conversation is how to improve the organizational goals? So if so, how to replace these remotely? Now, we actually, in the chamber ourselves, we have our tea break. So we have a tea break to kind of help with this. So we migrate that virtually, but we've also heard of teams that also send on what you can see outside your window just to kind of keep you going. So is there anything like that you could advise Dermot on, or any way to keep kind of going that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, Dermot, and one that, people are really struggling with. And I'm going to share an example of somebody I worked for a number of years ago, who was based in continental Europe, and it was a small team. And when we started working together, we were asked to turn on our cameras, which was unheard of at the time. I think we might have been using WebEx. But every time we had an interaction, the manager insisted that the camera was on. And we were horrified initially. And so, we were based in different countries. It has now become the norm. But we are hearing that people are starting to turn off their cameras and, oh, my camera isn't working, or muting, yourself throughout a meeting has become very normal. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So cameras on is absolutely, the baseline. Number two, as Caoimhe said, these virtual coffees and, dropping in for a tea, people having those organic conversations where, Dermot, maybe, the person who you used to sit next to is going to have a virtual coffee with you at 11 o'clock on a Monday. You don't have anything to talk about. You're just having a virtual coffee. And sometimes when I suggest that, I hear people saying, well, we have Zoom fatigue, and I understand that, but it is better to have that interaction than not have it at all. I mean, people are very isolated at home. And then thinking about those other things that you can do, like Caoimhe mentioned, I've been on virtual Christmas parties on that team that I talked about. As Caoimhe mentioned as well, like, what's outside your window. This team that I was on, we used to take a picture of something at the weekend that we did that was interesting or we enjoyed. We would share that at the beginning of a meeting the following week. There was always something small that we would do that brought the team together. And to be honest, I think it was one of the most engaged teams that I ever worked on in my nearly 20 years of working in organizations, was a virtual team, because the manager put time and effort into creating those little scenarios that helped people to feel connected. And just on the mute point there as well. So, we're asking everybody to mute, and on a big webinar like this, it's absolutely essential. But somebody shared an example with me recently that they were on a training class with the team, and the facilitator asked them to turn on their camera and to make sure they were not muted, which I thought was a bit strange. And so the facilitator said, well, we're trying to create a natural training environment. And obviously, if there's somebody in the background with a Kango hammer, then, for sure, you need to mute. But otherwise, if there's a dog barking or a child crying or whatever it is, they're normal environmental noises that we want to hear. And she said a few minutes into the training, somebody sneezed, and 3 people, almost under their breaths, in different locations, obviously, said, bless you. And she said it was like being back in a normal environment again, where there were normal sounds. So trying as much as you can to create that environment where people feel like it's a little bit more organic and a little bit more natural than cameras off, muting. There's nothing normal or natural about that, and very hard to get an engagement buzz going with the team if you're operating in that space.
And I suppose when you hear the normal sounds, it does kind of make it that little bit more human.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we're trying to recreate. We'll acknowledge it's not human, but, it's not what we would like it to be, but, we're doing our best.
Yeah. So lastly, the last question I'll ask you there, Jane, is from Tyg, and he said, trust is an intrinsic value which you cannot measure in employees, and some colleagues in a workforce sometimes just aren't very compatible and their personalities may clash. How do you think building professional trust can be achieved without personal conflict? And I suppose this is something we've seen a lot from our members querying, how you deal with those conflicts, especially remotely, because you don't have that human to human contact. It's all done virtually. So what advice would you give Tyg there?
So let me just make sure I understood the question, Caoimhe. So, sometimes we have a personality clash with somebody, and it's not easy to create trust in that space when you don't have a natural kind of affinity with somebody that, there's more of a conflict type relationship.
That's it. And I suppose even team members conflicting while remotely, how you kind of deal with that.
Yeah. So that's, wow, interesting question. So I think if it's between the manager and the individual, I think, opening up that dialogue and maybe acknowledging if there's some difficulty is the first port to call, and kind of naming it is really important, rather than hiding behind it and then trying to figure out maybe what that conflict is about. And And also being realistic that, sometimes people just don't get on well and you're never going to be best friends. However, you can find commonality in struggle sometimes, and even, sharing how difficult things are at the moment on both sides, is a point perhaps where you could find you might have some things in common. But being open about it, I think, is the first point. Secondly, if it's between two team members, I think that, working it out with each individual and figuring out what the problems are, and then if both parties are open to it, bringing them together, obviously not physically at the moment, but bringing them together and talking through what some of those challenges are, is really the only way to address. If there's any scope where you're in an environment where you're actually going in, so if you're in a retail outlet, for example, or you're, supporting a manufacturing facility, or, where you're in the office, a socially distant conversation would be better. But obviously, if you're doing it online, that is tougher. But kind of getting each person's perspective separately, and then, sharing your approach and bringing the two people together is really important. Sometimes using tools like a Myers-Briggs or a Gallup Strengths Finder or a Belbin Team Roles, using tools like that can help people see where their difficulties might stem from, because you kind of get into different personality traits and people can acknowledge that we're different and that we just do things differently, but can eventually find a space where they can respect each other.
Fantastic, Jane. Thank you so much for today. That was such a fantastic webinar, and I'm sure it's provided us all with some helpful tips and tricks going on. So thank you so much to Jane. If you want to know more information about Jane, we'll be releasing additional information about those masterclasses we'll be hosting with the Limerick Chamber SkillNet. And you can also visit her website at www.integrum.ie. I'll also be releasing that in the post-event comments. And lastly, just a huge thank you to today's sponsors, Careerwise. Joe has asked me to pass on a little note to remind you all that they're open and are passionate about supporting their clients and candidates. So if you have any queries at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team there at Careerwise, or visit www.careerwise.ie. I'll also be releasing that information in the post-event comments. So I hope you all have a lovely day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, folks. Bye now.
Bye now.